Forget Thor's hammer. Zakk Wylde's guitar is the real weapon of the gods. His pinch harmonics don't just squeal, they scream in utter agony. When Zakk plays, even his beard headbangs in perfect rhythm. Zakk's riffs are so heavy they might as well be classified as a natural disaster. But how did he become successful?
What we have now, Zaki Poo?
What is it that makes him one of the most sought-after guitar players in the hard rock category? Well, let's dig in and find out.
Like, subscribe, thank you.
Zachary Philip Wylde was born on January 14th, 1967 in Bayonne, New Jersey, located just across the Bayonne Bridge from Staten Island. He was born Jeffrey Philip Wieland, and he began playing guitar at 8 years old, but quickly lost interest. However, upon entering Jackson Memorial High School at the age of 14, all of a sudden he picked up the guitar again. He began taking lessons from Leroy Wright, who is the son of the high school football coach. And young Zakk Wylde also took some classical guitar lessons from a teacher in Freehold, New Jersey. A little later, he'd go and study with another instructor in Manhattan. Zakk Wylde formed his first band, Stonehenge, and played songs at parties, including songs like Bark at the Moon by Ozzy Osbourne, and songs by Black Sabbath and Rush as well. During this time, Zakk Wylde began dating a classmate named Barbara and Katerina, and they'd later get married. Wylde graduated from Jackson High School at the age of 18. After graduating, he got a job at a local supermarket, did some roofing, and played in several bands. But then Zakk started writing some original music, and he ended up joining a band called Riffs. He replaced Dave Lintz, who had actually joined the band Overkill. Upon joining Riffs, Zakk began calling himself Zachary Wylde, and he had gotten this name from the character Dr. Zachary Smith from the TV show Lost in Space. Riffs played a lot of original songs and covered tunes by Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. And around this time, Zakk also started giving guitar lessons in Jackson, New Jersey. Riffs played a few gigs in the southern Jersey area. They performed at a place called Close Encounters, as well as the famous Stone Pony. But then something would come along that would change Zakk's life forever. Young Zakk was really into Howard Stern at the time, and he had heard on Stern's show that Ozzy happened to have been looking for a guitar player. He totally dismissed it, but at a Riffs gig, rock photographers Mark Weiss and David Feld had shown up. They really liked Zakk's playing, and so Dave told Zakk that Ozzy was looking for this new guitar player and said that they would go ahead and put together a press kit and send it to him. By this time, Zakk's playing had really evolved into something unique. He ended up blending rock influences such as Tony Iommi, Frank Marino, Jimmy Page, and Randy Rhoads, and he blended those with some killer fusion players like Al Di Meola and John McLaughlin. This gave young Zakk a very unique sound, and so with help from his friend, Zakk ended up recording a 4-track demo. In the demo, Zakk shows off some seriously intense pentatonic riffage and then takes a twist by throwing in a whole tone lick. Considering the state of guitar soloing at the time, with everything either modal or pentatonic, the whole tone lick essentially said, now time for something completely different. So they send this demo along with the press kit. Zakk gets the audition. And during the audition, he played a couple of Ozzy songs and some acoustic and classical music. And then when he left, he thought he just totally blew it. However, soon he got a call from Ozzy's wife Sharon offering the coveted position. So at the age of 20 years old, Zakk Wylde was now officially in Ozzy Osbourne's band. But they decided they would give him a cooler sounding name, and that's how Zakk Wylde was born. On December 15th, 1987, at the Hard Rock Cafe in New York City, Ozzy made the introduction to Zakk Wylde as his new guitar player.
Next thing I knew, I was in L.A. and then playing in men's prisons and the whole bit,
Yeah, we did a prison tour. I told him he was going to come and play for the Queen of England. So
And you took him to a prison?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. What a good trick.
So Zakk ended up making his recording debut in 1988 with the album No Rest for the Wicked. And he became quickly one of the most talked about young guitar players in metal. For one thing, he brought this whole new feel to Ozzy's sound. He made it much more raw and dangerous. It was a huge metamorphosis because he had gone from this unknown teenager playing in small clubs in Jersey to touring the world in huge arenas with Ozzy practically overnight. Imagine a concert so massive, it could only happen as the Cold War was thawing. In the summer of '89, Moscow became the unlikely epicenter of a cultural earthquake. Ozzy Osbourne with his brand new guitar player were sharing the stage with Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, and Scorpions. But what happened next would cement Zakk's place in metal history. The resulting live EP, Just Say Ozzy, wasn't just a souvenir. It was a sonic time capsule. With Geezer Butler's thunderous bass and Randy Castillo's precision drumming, Zakk's guitar work elevated Ozzy classics to brand new heights. And here's where it gets interesting. Their rendition of Shot in the Dark on this EP is often hailed as the most definitive version. But Zakk was just getting warmed up. In 1990, Ozzy, Zakk Wylde, Randy Castillo, and Bob Daisley recorded No More Tears. This being Zakk's second studio album with Osbourne, it is widely considered one of Zakk's best performances ever. The album had a strong balance of song. They had a true power ballad of the era, Mama, I'm Coming Home, and then the absolute hard rock in Mr. Tinker Train. And it really showed an evolution in Zakk Wylde's style. He started incorporating some of his southern rock chicken pickin' chops into his playing. He also had a lot of reckless abandon in his leads, which complemented his already solid rhythm style. Now, what's also interesting is that the subsequent tour was actually supposed to be called No More Tours, because at that point, Ozzy was planning on retiring. This was in 1990, so history will show that Ozzy just could not get enough. But they did a lot of taping for this one, resulting in Live and Loud, which contained songs from the tour, and that was released in '92. And their live performance of I Don't Want to Change the World actually got Ozzy a Grammy that very year. In '92, while he was still playing with Ozzy, Zakk ended up forming a band called Lynyrd Skynyrd, a play on words of the name Lynyrd Skynyrd, and he had actually gotten this band together with bassist James Lomenzo and drummer Greg D'Angelo. And they did a lot of classic and southern rock covers. They put together the track Farm Fiddlin' for a compilation album. And in 1993, Zakk actually had a one-off performance with the Allman Brothers Band, filling in for Dickie Betts. But things weren't working out with the drummer, so they had to bring in Brian Tichy to take D'Angelo's place. But then they changed to a much better name, Pride and Glory. They got a record deal on Geffen, and they put out their self-titled debut. And this album turned out to be a really good blend of southern rock, metal, blues, and country. But unfortunately, the band really achieved limited success. James Lomenzo would end up leaving, getting replaced by James DeServio. In December of '94, they do their last show, but they were joined on stage by Slash, who made a guest appearance. So at least they went out with a bang, that's for sure. And if you're into Slash, I just covered him last week. Check that one out. Also in 1994, Zakk Wylde became friends with Blind Melon singer Shannon Hoon, and they actually got together and wrote some songs. Zakk was trying to help Shannon get sober. Unfortunately, Zakk's efforts were in vain, because not too long later, Shannon would die of a drug overdose. But while Zakk was working with Shannon, Ozzy had decided to come out of retirement. So he put the band together with Randy Castillo, Zakk Wylde, and Mike Inez to record the next album. And this resulted in a lot of scrapped recording sessions. They had versions of songs with Inez on the bass and with Lomenzo on bass. Epic Records had hired Michael Wagner to come in and produce. And the Ozzy camp said, hey, we want it to sound like No More Tears. So they ended up putting together 7 songs with Michael Wagner. But then Epic Records turns around and tells Wagner they wanted the album to sound like Soundgarden. Of course, Wagner got pissed. He was like, no way, it's impossible to change the direction of this record now that 7 songs have already been done. So despite everything they had done, the label just abandoned the project. And both Ozzy and Michael Wagner were completely disappointed with this whole thing. And at that point, both of them were wanting to just get out of the music business altogether. 2 of Wagner's original 7 recordings were released as B-sides on singles Amy and Living with the Enemy. The song called Slow Burn from the session is still unreleased at this point. And they also did a couple that ended up on the next album, Osmosis, but they were in totally different format. Perry Mason, See You on the Other Side, Tomorrow, and Old LA Tonight. See You on the Other Side, for example, was actually put out on Ozzy's box set in 2005 called Prince of Darkness, and it actually has a saxophone and female choir. But Epic Records was still feeling the Soundgarden vibe, so they brought in Michael Beinhorn. But also, they didn't bring back Randy Castillo, Mike Inez, or James Lomenzo. Instead, they had Dean Castronovo and Geezer Butler. And during the time of recording Osmosis, Zakk would ditch out at about 3:30 in the morning to a place in New York called Bruise, and he would end up jamming some acoustic stuff for the limited audiences there. According to the owner, he'd just show up about 3:30 when a few people were there singing and playing, but it turned out to actually be the proving grounds for the stuff that would later become Book of Shadows. Just 3 days before Osmosis was released, on October 21st, 1995, Zakk got the sad news that Shannon Hoon had passed away. So he ended up writing the song Throwing It All Away in his honor, which will also end up on Book of Shadows. Around this time, Zakk Wylde also started getting together with Duff McKagan, the bass player for Guns N' Roses, over at his place. And they ended up kicking out a few demos. Some of the riffs from those demos would end up being used on Black Label Society's first album, Sonic Brew. This was also the first album where Zakk didn't have a hand in writing every single song. The most notable example being My Little Man, which was a part of a whole slew of songs that Ozzy had written with Steve Vai, though Vai wasn't brought in to play anything on it. But the song does have Steve Vai written all over it. So after Osmosis was released, Zakk ended up really torn between joining Guns N' Roses and touring with Ozzy. But he ended up taking too long to decide. So Ozzy's like, screw this, and he brought in Joel Holmes to play guitar on the Osmosis tour. Zakk Wylde's other option with Guns N' Roses also faded out really quick when he got a message from Guns N' Roses saying that his services just were not needed. And this put Zakk at a crossroads in his career. Pride and Glory was already broken up. Zakk still had this contractual obligation to fulfill with Geffen Records. And so no time was a better time to make the album Book of Shadows, which he compiled and recorded various unreleased material that he had built up over time. So he ended up bringing in James Lomenzo and drummer Joe Vitale for the project. And they ended up releasing the album in 1996 on Geffen Records. So then right after the album's release, Zakk Wylde gets contacted by Nick Cantonese, who's a guitar player from Pittsburgh. That might seem like this was just another fan reaching out, but instead this was the musical equivalent of sliding into DMs before DMs were even a thing. Cantonese was bold. He just said, hey Zakk, I want to join your touring band. And Zakk at this point was just like, yeah, sure, why not? Now during this tour, Zakk keeps running into this drummer, Phil Ondich, not once, not twice, but 3 times. San Francisco, Columbus, Roanoke. So in Roanoke, Zakk, probably thinking the 3rd time's a charm, so he ends up sharing the new song with Phil. This song, Beneath the Tree, would become the catalyst for Black Label Society. Zakk Wylde at this point is producing demos and touring Japan, playing benefits. He's busier than the cat in a room full of laser pointers. But then Ozzy decides he's going to get the old band back together again. Calling in Randy Castillo, Zakk Wylde, and Mike Inez. They end up touring. Ozfest 98 ads are out, featuring this whole brand new lineup, which is the old lineup. And then Ozzy again fires them all. No explanation, no warning. It's the musical equivalent of being left at the altar, but instead of a jilted bride, it's a bunch of long-haired metalheads wondering what the hell just happened. So again, Zakk faces yet another turning point in his career. Fresh off a solo show in Italy, Zakk decides it's time to get serious. So he books some studio time in Miami, and they initially called the project Hell's Kitchen. Yep, this is before Gordon Ramsay was yelling at aspiring chefs.
This fucking pigeon's that raw it can still fly.
But trademark issues ended up rearing their ugly head. So Hell's Kitchen was totally off the menu. It was at that point they ended up calling themselves Black Label Society. Their debut was originally called Sonic Brewery, but they gave it a slight rebrand to Sonic Brew. The only problem was, by this time, all the artwork and the liner notes and everything were already designed with the Hell's Kitchen theme. So what'd they do? Change it? Nope, they kept it. So it turned out to be kind of like a concept album with a bunch of culinary references in it. So the album ended up getting released in Japan on October 28th of 1998. It had 13 tracks. In the US, the release was delayed. The band found themselves searching for a record label, and so they decided to go ahead and remix the album. They ended up adding Lost My Better Half to the album, turning out to be the heaviest song that he had ever recorded by that point. They found a deal with Spitfire Records, and so they released their album on May 4th of 1999. Zakk needed a bass player for the band. He advertised the position in guitar magazines. But instead of hiring somebody new, he ended up bringing back in John J.D. DeServio, who had been the bassist for Pride and Glory. Zakk played guitar and sang, Nick Cantonese played rhythm guitar, DeServio played bass, and Phil, who ended up being nicknamed Filth, played drums. And this turned out to be the first official lineup of Black Label Society. They ended up performing their first show in Japan on May 1st of 1999. And at the end of the first tour in Japan, Stephen Pearcy, who was the lead singer of Rat, ended up joining Black Label Society on stage. They covered Paranoid by Black Sabbath, and the performance turned out to be a 100% total train wreck. Nevertheless, Black Label Society ended up moving on and touring Europe. They played the Dynamo Open Air 99, but the crowd is so big, you would think they're giving away free beer and tax advice. And then Black Label Society was all set to conquer America. Tours are planned, roadies are ready, and then they ended up canceling everything. What happened was Phil ended up breaking his arm while jet skiing. At least that's what the official story was. Turns out, Johnny Walker, purveyor of fine scotch and apparent album art critic, took one look at Black Label Society's cover and said, "Hey, that looks just like our bottle." So to make things as clear as mud, they decided to re-release the album. But at that point, they also put in a bonus track. So they got together and recorded No More Tears 2000, which one could assume is probably about the band's accountant after all this reshuffling. So the re-release ended up hitting the merch stands before it even reached the stores. And in a stroke of genius, or perhaps desperation, they included a guitar pick in each case. And then finally, in September of '99, Black Label was able to go ahead and get on with the American tour. And the tour ended up being a success, despite playing a whole ton of covers. And as winter was descending, Zakk and Ondich retreated to Rumbo Recorders in LA, ready to make an album, but probably hoping that they don't anger any more liquor companies in the process. The year is 2000, Y2K did not end the world, but Black Label Society was about to drop their next album, Stronger Than Death. For this album, they decided to spice things up by inviting in catcher for the New York Mets, Mike Piazza, into the studio. So he went ahead and laid down some growls for the title track, because nothing says heavy metal like a baseball player growling into a mic. But lo and behold, Axl Rose happened to be in the studio next door working on Chinese Democracy. So he ended up popping in to visit several times. There were no collaborations between any of them, but the guys were definitely busy. Besides playing drums, Phil Ondich was also drawing up the album artwork. Zakk was coming and going from the studio, adding more guitar parts to the album as he went. They ended up releasing Stronger Than Death on March 8th of 2000, and it had the bonus track Bullet Inside Your Head. And during the spring of 2000, the movie Rockstar was being filmed. Zakk Wylde, Cantonese, and Koalo, who is Black Label Society's guitar technician, ended up getting parts in the movie. This also featured Mark Wahlberg and Jennifer Aniston.
Stand up and shine! Guy, they love each other and knows that he's got to do what he's got to do to fulfill this dream. You're going to be great, babe.
The group also did some songs for the movie's soundtrack, and they had brought in Jeff Scott Soto, who had sang for Yngwie Malmsteen's band, and they also had Mike Matejevic, who was in the band Steelheart, also lending vocals to the effort. And this was like a who's who of rockers during that time. They had Jeff Pilson from Dokken playing bass, Jason Bonham on the drums. Before Black Label Society was actually going on tour to support Stronger Than Death, DeServio ended up leaving the group, so they brought in Steve S.O.B. Gibb, who it turns out is the son of Barry Gibb from the Bee Gees. So they went on the Penchant for Violence tour in Japan, starting on June 14th of 2000. And when they finished their tour, they started immediately on the U.S. tour, and things just got crazy from there. Their first show was in Anaheim, California, playing for a packed Sun Theater. Not even 5 songs in, drummer Phil Ondich collapsed off of his drum set. It turned out it was a combination of the stomach flu and exhaustion, but the drummer from their opening act, Crowbar, stepped in to replace him on the drum seat. And then they ended up having to cancel the next 2 shows. But then somewhere along the line, Zakk Wylde's prized guitar, the Grail, fell out of the trailer somewhere between Dallas and Houston. So they put out ads and posters and everything they could, trying to find it, to no avail. But then, they're playing in Highland, Indiana, and Ondich's flu comes back worse than ever. But Zakk had just had enough of it, and he and Phil had gotten into a fight on stage, and so Phil ended up splitting. So Crowbar's drummer, Nunemacher, agreed to join the band on a permanent basis. They ended up renaming the tour from Penchant for Violence to Penchant for Problems, but then the hits kept coming. They ended up losing their tour manager, their sound man quit, their guitar tech took off, and their bus driver threatened to kill them. And then after all of that, they ended up running out of money and having to cancel the rest of the tour. But Zakk got right back on the horse, and he and Nunemacher recorded some studio tracks for a second album. And this included a song called Like a Bird, a cover of Neil Young's Heart of Gold, and a cover of Black Sabbath's Snowblind. And they put this out on January 16th of 2001. And in the summer of that same year, they were the main act to open Ozzfest. Well, Gibb apparently had enough because he ended up leaving in the middle of the tour, so they brought back Mike Inez. Inez then had to fly back to California in early August because he had to fulfill obligations with another band that he had. So they brought in their bass technician, Frey Thaler, for a few shows towards the end of Ozzfest. During the tour, Zakk had recorded a few demos with a drummer named Christian Wurr, and he was hoping that Ozzy might use them on his next album. And Zakk even sang them in a higher key than usual, trying to illustrate how it might sound if Ozzy were singing them. And he was planning on putting the tracks in Pro Tools so Ozzy could then go ahead and re-record his voice, but Ozzy was like, nope, they sound way too much like Black Label Society. So Zakk kept the songs for the next Black Label Society album. And the demos were Bleed For Me, Life, Birth, Blood, Doom, Demise of Sanity, and a different piano version of A Bridge to Cross, as well as I'll Find the Way. Robert Trujillo, who would end up playing bass for Metallica, had played on 2 of the tracks. And during this time, Sharon Osbourne ended up sending Zakk Wylde to rehab. Now, she herself was actually going through chemo at the time, so they had to cancel a few Ozzy shows as well. But despite all of this, Black Label Society was riding high. They got a lot of publicity, and the Ozzfest crowd was eating it up like candy. And then late July of 2002, Zakk Wylde took on the persona of what would be a heavy metal Johnny Cash, recording The Blessed Hell Ride and No Other. And around this point, Rob Trujillo ended up joining Metallica, so they brought back their old stalwart on bass, Mike Inez, again. Black Label Society released a live concert DVD titled Boozed, Bruised, and Broken Boned, live with the Detroit chapter. Zakk's pan-European tour followed Ozzfest, faced a lot of postponements due to Ozzy's health issues during that time. Zakk also made a notable appearance at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, donating his first Les Paul guitar. Preparations for Ozzy's tour, including the addition of bassist Rob Blasco Nicholson, were halted when Ozzy suffered a horrible ATV accident. This broke nearly every bone in his body. So during Osbourne's break, Zakk recorded Hangover Music Volume 6, an acoustic piano-based album released in April of 2004. But Black Label Society was really tired of Spitfire Records, so they wanted to change labels. They began work on a new heavy album with producer Barry Conley, and they also paused to perform at Ozzfest 2004. And then they got James Lomenzo back on bass, permanently. So in December 2004, Zakk announced a multi-album deal with Artemis Records, with their 7th album, Mafia, set for release in March of 2005. Then tragedy struck. Zakk got the news that his dear friend Dimebag Darrell had been killed by a deranged fan, as I have covered a couple videos back in much more detail. Nevertheless, Zakk was extremely shook up over the incident, understandably. He ended up dedicating his song In This River to Dimebag, and in every live show he's done since, he's always made that dedication to him. So they ended up touring behind Mafia, and also did a Skynyrd cover for an unreleased tribute album, and also played at Ozzfest 2005. And then they underwent some more lineup changes, bringing back in John DeServio to replace James Lomenzo on the bass. But they were able to switch labels, and they ended up signing with Roadrunner, where they put out Shot to Hell and a live DVD. Black Label Society went on their first American tour in 2008, called the Black Label Bash Tour, and they had Sevendust opening for them. In 2009, they embarked on their Pedal to the Metal Tour, which was actually a really big event in the metal music scene at the time. Along with Black Label Society, Mudvayne was featured, as well as Static X, Dope, Bury Your Dead, and others. But then another huge setback for Zakk occurred in 2009, when he was hospitalized with blood clots in both his lungs and one leg. He had actually completed a concert in Montana on August 19th, but had to be taken to a hospital. And after he was admitted, his condition just got worse. By that time, Twitter was in existence, and he tweeted out, "To all our Black Label family worldwide, thanks for all the get wells. Every 48 hours in the ER to check my blood. Had a CT scan today and blood clots in each of my lungs as well as my leg." And of course, he couldn't sing because that could possibly end up causing a full-on embolism. But nevertheless, Zakk kept his spirits up, but it was quite a difficult summer in 2009 for him. Also, Ozzy had announced that he was searching for a new guitar player without even informing Zakk. He ended up performing at BlizzCon convention with a new guitar player, Gus G from Firewind. Zakk wasn't too surprised by it, though. The thing that was really sticking in Ozzy's craw was what Zakk was doing with Black Label Society. He felt like everything Zakk was bringing to him somehow was in the vein of that band, and he didn't want anything to do with it. After Zakk recovered, he was back in the saddle again, releasing the album Order of the Black in 2010, which he had actually recorded in his own studio, called the Black Label Bunker. And around this time, Zakk's talents were also in demand by other artists. He played lead guitar on My Darkest Day's first single, which also involved Chad Kroeger from Nickelback, who was reportedly worth millions, expanding Zakk's influence beyond just a regular heavy metal circle. Zakk also served as a judge for the 8th Annual Independent Music Awards in 2010. He had a film role, appearing as Jed, who's Bones' uncle, in the 2010 film Bones, and he also made an appearance as a playable character in the Guitar Hero World Tour game. Players were able to unlock his character by winning a guitar battle against him and completing Black Label Society's song Stillborn. In 2012, Zakk participated in the Ozzy and Friends tour. This tour turned out to be a replacement for a majority of the Black Sabbath reunion tour dates. During that time, Tony Iommi had just been diagnosed with lymphoma, so Sabbath was not able to continue. However, they did do one show of the European tour at the Download Festival, which took place in England on June 10th. Ozzy then embarked on a 17-date tour as part of this Ozzy and Friends, with special guests including Slash, Zakk Wylde, Tom Morello, and Geezer Butler. Zakk had also put together the band called Zakk Sabbath, which has been sporadically performing since 2014, covering Sabbath's earlier material. It brought Zakk back to the days of his youth, and in 2020, Zakk Sabbath released a tribute album to Black Sabbath, and it turned out to be a really faithful, intense, hard-hitting rendition of Black Sabbath's debut album. And that actually marked the 50th anniversary of Black Sabbath's debut album when they released it. This album was called Vertigo, and they actually had recorded it live in a studio, with a film crew documenting the entire process. In 2022, Zakk Wylde confirmed rumors and anonymous reports about him joining Pantera for what was called a reunion tour. Now, he stated these rumors were true, but he maintained that he wasn't actually joining the band. Zakk believed that Dimebag Darrell was just irreplaceable, so he saw himself more as a guest member for upcoming concerts and festival appearances. He clarified that the current lineup was not Pantera, which consisted of Phil Anselmo and Rex Brown, as well as the actual lineup, which had Dimebag Darrell and his brother Vinny, both who had passed away. But he made the comparison with Led Zeppelin's performances with Jason Bonham, which many said were just phenomenal. Bonham's performance was highly acclaimed, with a lot of people just saying he crushed it. But the tour was actually viewed as a celebration of Pantera's music and the legacy of Vinny and Dunn, and it was seen as a great opportunity for fans to be able to experience Pantera's live music once again, in some way, shape, or form. And Zakk expressed his honor at being a part of the project. And they also brought in Charlie Benatti from Anthrax to play the drums in honor of Vinny. And the estates of Pantera's late co-founders, Vinny and Dime, both approved of this lineup and subsequent performances. So they headlined major festivals in North America and Europe, and also performed their own headline shows. And before Vinny's passing, there had been discussions about an actual reunion. However, with half the band gone, it was more of a tribute than a reunion anyway. Nevertheless, Zakk has dedicated himself to keeping Dime's musical style alive the best he can. Both guitar players possess unique harmonic ability, albeit in different ways. Zakk also favored more tube amps, while Dime favored solid-state amps, especially in the studio. But Pantera fans are really divided on the reunion, with some considering it a disrespectful use of Pantera's name. and still others were happy to see at least a version of the Pantera lineup still performing under that name. But from Zakk Wylde's perspective, the goal was to honor his fallen brother, Dime. Zakk had been vocal in expressing his respect for Dime, and he was likely the best choice to take over guitar duties for such a high-profile tribute. A huge thanks to all my subscribers. I really appreciate the feedback and the inspiration. Make sure you smack that subscribe button. And while you're at it, if you could kindly hit the like button, I do appreciate it. I want to thank you so much for watching.